Hello, this is Stephen Hawley Martin. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to be speaking with F. Holmes Atwater, also known as Skip Atwater. Skip was a training officer with a secret U.S. Army intelligence unit back in the Cold War days that used remote viewing to spy on the Soviets and Eastern Bloc nations. And that's what we're going to talk about. Thanks for being here, Skip. Now,
I imagine you can't really talk about some of the ways that you used remote viewing or the sites or installations or whatever that you might have investigated. I suppose that's all classified. Is that correct?
A lot of it has been declassified, and there's probably about 30% that has not been declassified. Now, let me be clear that when I say declassified, it means if you request to the Freedom of Information Act a certain paper, you get the declassified version, which in reality means it's been redacted. Redacted means they take a black magic marker and scratch over all the interesting parts.
Yes, a lot of good that does.
And so then they say, here, it's declassified, you can read it. But
So when you were doing the remote viewing, I know you trained a lot of people. You had different criteria for selecting what sort of person to train who might have this talent. And how many remote viewers would you have at any one time, for example?
Yeah, I like to make it clear that I myself was not a remote viewer. I was experiential and understood what was going on, but one of the ways in which I maintained my reputation when I would visit my military commanders and show them a report, they would look at me kind of out of the corner of their eye and say, well, do you do this? And I would say, oh, no, I don't do that. And so that gave me some sort of credibility in their eyes as to testifying about the validity of the information. My job was the operations and training officer, so what I did was to set up training programs to teach other people, and then actually ran the operations, meaning I would develop teams of interviewers and remote viewers and see that a proper report got written about what it is they perceived and write it in military jargon so that it could be passed throughout the intelligence community.
I see. Well, when you had a particular target or whatever you called it in the military parlance that you wanted to investigate with remote viewing, did you just have one individual do that, or did a whole group do it and then you compared notes? How did that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's pretty complex. There are so many interesting things that can happen in remote viewing. You have to understand that if you think let's pretend that we understand for a minute how remote viewing works, and that pretending would involve quantum mechanics and quantum entanglement, meaning that when a remote viewer needs to describe a particular place that he somehow has entangled, quantum entanglement across time and space, and he has some way of knowing or perceiving this other location or activity through quantum entanglement. Now, what that means is that his perception is boundless. So there becomes a problem when you say, oh, I want to work these two remote viewers against target X. The problem being that how do you keep one remote viewer from remote viewing the other's work as opposed to remote viewing the actual target? And it's a matter of intent. This whole thing comes down to an understanding now of intent, attention, and your expectation, and being in control of those. So your intent has to be pure. Now imagine that we have Mr. Jones, and he always does a great job at remote viewing, and everybody pats him on the back. And then we have Mr. Smith, who does, about 50%. He does fine, but he just isn't doing so well. And so down inside him, he's saying, God, I wish I was getting the praise of this other guy. Mr. Jones does so well all the time. And so he starts remote viewing Mr. Jones' own remote viewing session.
Huh.
Now,
or we could even remote view the results of Mr. Jones' session.
Exactly.
Because time, there is no time, is that correct?
Exactly.
Future, past, or whatever.
Yeah, so what happens if he remote views Mr. Jones' really bad session?
Right.
Then you have two confirmatory reports about exactly the wrong thing.
I see.
So
well,
it's very difficult. Your idea about tasking it to different people and then comparing their results is a valid situation, but you got to be careful.
Well, I'm recalling a book I read by Stephen Schwartz. You mentioned his name earlier. I've forgotten the name of it, but the book is quite interesting. And Stephen Schwartz was never in the Army or anything. He just does the remote viewing to find shipwrecks and things like that,
yes.
I guess. Or
psychic archaeology.
Right. And he was talking about an exercise that he went through, and after teaching a class in remote viewing down at the ARE, the Association for Research in
He
Latin.
does teach a very nice class down there.
Yeah, in Virginia Beach. And he had, I think, 43 people in this class, and he had them, it was 6 months before Saddam Hussein was captured after the Gulf War, and he had the 43 people remote view the capture of Saddam Hussein, which then later took place, 6 or 9 months later. And it was amazing. What he did was take all of the results from the 43, and he kind of saw where there were similarities and so forth, and put it all together. And he nailed it down to, where the location, the fact that he was underground in a chamber, that he had a pistol with him, that he had a certain amount of money with him, all these things that were just, but that was done by comparing notes between the different viewers, so that you wouldn't do something like that?
Well, in his case, he had a classroom full of people that were sort of naive to each other.
Right.
In our class, in our operations, what we did is we forbade any of the remote viewing teams to talk to each other. They are not allowed to talk about which operation they're on, and we never shared results of anyone's operation with somebody else.
Well, then,
However,
and also you didn't. The person who's leading it, the interviewer, and so they didn't even know. None of them knew what they were supposed to be doing.
That's correct.
It was in a sealed envelope. Or how did that work?
Well, you can also use multiple interviewers. So we had 3 separate interviewers and 3 separate teams. So the interviewers couldn't talk to each other, and they might be working. I sat at the head of all that and would give one task to one task to the other, one task to the other, and they weren't allowed to talk to each other, so nobody knew what anybody was working on. One team could be working on Project Alpha and the next one on Project Zebra, and they didn't know, and that seemed to reduce the crosstalk, you might say, between the results. But there's one other factor, and that is some remote viewers are really good at describing, let's say, for example, the colors of the building where the person is hiding. But they have never been able to count how many floors that building has. So you can always depend on that person for finding the building and what color it is, but you'd never believe them when it comes to what floor the person is on, because they just can't do that. Whereas another person does very, very well in terms of telling what floor they're on, can tell you what's north, south, east, and west of the building, but they never get a color right. And so, yes, you can compare different remote viewers' perceptions to come up with a composite answer, but you need to know a little bit about their track record and what things do they have a tendency for describing right, and what things they don't do so well at describing.
I see. Well, where did the information about a target, who had that? Just you?
Well, that's good. I'm glad you followed up on that question. It was done in a progressive situation. Initially, an outside agency, let's say the FBI or CIA or Drug Enforcement Agency would come in with a target. We need to know this information. So it would then get converted into questions that a remote viewer could answer. Describe the building, describe the activities of this person, whatever. And you would put that in a sealed envelope with a picture or so forth in the envelope. And then you would hand that to the interviewer, and you'd say, this has been designated as Project 37 Alpha 2. We need an area description, and that's all you would say to them. They would go off and do a session or 2 sessions, and they would bring back to me, the operations officer, say, we have an open, arid desert area with 3 buildings and no vehicles. And I would say to them, that sounds correct. Find out more about the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they knew a little bit at that point in time. By the time they went into their second session, they knew a little bit. But they didn't know I was looking for a hiding criminal or a nuclear weapon or an airplane. All they knew is, yes, there's some buildings in the desert and we want to know more about that. So the interviewer knew that much. So they would go back, and in their remote viewing session, they would ask the remote viewer, remember the area we talked about yesterday? Contact that area again and tell me more about the buildings. And that would be the only instruction to the remote viewer.
I guess because if you gave them too much instruction, they would start fantasizing or whatever.
Yes. I mean, if I say to you right now, listen, I'm going to go to lunch today at McDonald's. Describe my location to me.
Right.
Well, then suddenly all your memories of any time you'd ever been into McDonald's are competing with your psychic perceptions.
Exactly.
There is no way to sift out the difference.
Did the hostages that were in Iran, I guess, back in the late 80s that were released right after Reagan took office, did you all do any work on them?
Yes, we did over 200 sessions in trying to locate where they are, what their medical conditions were, and so forth.
Was that successful? Were you accurate?
Well, we had, when it was rated by the Pentagon, it said we were as successful as any other intelligence collection methodology. We had some very strong successes in terms of locating some underground utility tunnels, like where they bury phone wires and things like that, and that they were guarded and couldn't be used by an assault force. And in the medical assessment of individuals that might be released and might be brought home, those were the 2 sort of areas where we had some success.
I see. That's very interesting. Is the Stargate program still going on?
The name of the program, Stargate, that was basically a relationship between the Stanford Research Institute, the Army activity, and some Defense Intelligence Agency. That program is no longer ongoing.
Is the government still using remote viewing to gather information? Or do you know?
Or could I say?
Or could you say?
I would suspect that in today's times that any source of information would be very valuable to them.
Yeah. Well, I would think if they're not using it, I wonder why. Were there people, you get into all this, and some people's religious beliefs might be, they think Satan was behind it. Did you run into anything like that?
Occasionally, it's an interesting notion that anything that we don't understand, we tend to fear.
Sure.
And so the very idea that, what do you mean you can describe that? I can't do that, therefore it must be the work of the devil.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a non sequitur. It sort of is not a logical argument, because there's been, over the last 30 years, very, 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 very sufficient proof that there is something going on here. Now, it's not that we completely understand the mechanism of action, but there is no disagreement in the scientific community that there is some anomaly, some perceptual anomaly going on here that's not in our ordinary perceptual realm.
What does this do, though, to, when I grew up and went to school and studied biology, and I still run into people that believe this. In fact, I interviewed a doctor on my show about a year ago who believes that consciousness is created by the brain, that it's something to do with electrons jumping across synapses in the brain, that that's where it is, inside your skull, and it's nowhere else. And really the view is that a human being is like some sort of a mechanism, a robot that has a computer-like brain that somehow with these electrons creates a sense of awareness. And that, of course, would not compute, and when we know that our awareness is practically infinite, that we can go forward in time and backward in time and look at things that are far away, or even on Mars. And I want to ask you about Joe Monocle's trip to Mars here in a minute.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no convincing people. It wasn't all that long ago, a couple hundred years ago, that the Earth was flat.
Right.
And you could not convince people otherwise. It was obvious. Just look at that. See, look with your own eyes. You can see it's flat. How can it possibly be round? There was a time not so long ago that they thought the brain was a cooling manifold. That thing inside our head, because they measured the temperature of it, and it looked like a bunch of pipes in there, and it said, this is the organ that cools the blood in the body. That's the only thing that thing does. And now they've said, oh no, consciousness itself emerges from the brain.
And the brain really, it seems to me, is a receiver, and your connection between your consciousness and your body, so you can
exactly. When you watch a television, the actors and actresses in drama are not actually inside the television. It's passing through the television for your perception. Right. And I think probably that's sort of the way the brain is. It's not actually inside the brain there. It's just passing through the brain. It is our television to the world, sort of.
We've got about 4 minutes left here, and I want to ask you quickly about Joe Monocle, who apparently was one of the most successful remote viewers who worked under you, and isn't he now with the Monroe Institute as well?
Joe is not an employee of the Institute. However, he lives here. He's my neighbor, and he comes and does some guest speaking engagements for us. But he's continued his professional interest in remote viewing ever since he left the Army in '84, and has become...
He's written a number of books and so forth about
it. Right, and has become quite well known for his activity.
What I wanted to ask you about, though, Skip, is when you went down to the Monroe Institute with him to do some training of Joe, mm-hmm. and your mission or your target was Mars. Could you tell us about that?
Well, sure. We entered into a classified contract with Robert Monroe to train Joe McMoneagle for 10 weeks of training, not all back-to-back, but over a period of a year, 10 weeks of training. And my job was to bring down targets every week to measure, to calibrate whether or not the training was improving. One of the targets that I brought down was a sealed envelope that said, describe these areas on the planet Mars 1 million years BC. And so I began to read different coordinates, planetary coordinates of the planet Mars. Now, he did not know that. That information was in a sealed envelope, and I just read 38 degrees north, 22 degrees west. That's the only numbers I used. But inside the sealed envelope, it said the planet Mars, 1 million years BC. And he began to describe some very, very interesting things about very, very ancient civilization on Mars that had perished due to a catastrophic or astronomical event where the atmosphere was ripped off of the planet Mars and destroyed the civilization.
That's absolutely fantastic. Well, we're almost out of time. We've been speaking with Skip Atwater, the name of his book. I suggest you go out and get it if you want to find out more about remote viewing and about the U.S. Army intelligence role in that back in the 70s and 80s. Name of it is Captain of My Ship, Master of My Soul. Well, thanks so much for being with us today, Skip. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and we wish you a lot of luck with the new ebook and a lot of luck in your career there at the Monroe Institute.
Thank you.
How could somebody find out more about the Monroe Institute in case they'd like to go for a visit?
Sure, just monroeinstitute.org. And you can, of course, Google the Monroe Institute and get lots and lots of things, and we have a YouTube site, but the best way is just monroeinstitute.org.
Well, thanks so much for being with us today.
All right, thank you.